Two of Formula One's biggest engine manufacturers face serious allegations, and the 2026 season has not even started yet. Paddock sources have identified Mercedes and Red Bull as the teams at the center of a growing controversy over the new compression ratio rules, with their rivals now demanding answers and the FIA caught in the middle. We explain what these manufacturers allegedly discovered buried in the rulebook and why it could trigger the first major protest of the new regulations era. This one might surprise you. The 2026 Formula One regulations represent the biggest shake-up to the sport's power unit in over a decade. New engines, new rules, and a complete reset of the competitive order were supposed to define this era. But here is the thing. Before a single car has turned a racing lap under these new regulations, we already have our first major controversy brewing. Reports emerged on December 19th that rival engine manufacturers had formally requested clarification from the FIA about a suspected loophole, and the issue centers on something called the compression ratio and how it gets measured. Without diving too deep into the engineering, compression ratio describes how much the air and fuel mixture gets squeezed inside the engine before ignition occurs. Higher compression ratios generally translate to more power and better fuel efficiency. That makes it a big deal. Under the previous regulations, the maximum compression ratio sat at 18.0, but for 2026, that limit dropped to 16.0. On paper, every manufacturer should be operating under the same constraints, and that is when things start to get interesting. The FIA measures compression ratio under what they call static conditions at ambient temperature, which means when the engine sits cold and motionless. This procedure has been the standard for years, but the problem is that metal expands when it heats up. Basic physics. Sources allege that some manufacturers have designed their engine components to deliberately expand beyond normal levels when the engine reaches operating temperature on track. The mechanism works like this. The engine passes inspection at the legal 16.0 limit while cold in the garage, but once it hits the circuit running at full temperature, those carefully engineered components start expanding. The piston moves closer to the top of the cylinder, and the effective compression ratio climbs higher than what the rules intended. Paddock estimates put this advantage at around 15 horsepower and approximately 0.3 of a second per lap. In modern Formula One, where races get decided by margins measured in hundredths of a second, 0.3 represents an enormous gap between winning and losing. Multiple high-level Paddock sources and other outlets have identified two manufacturers at the center of this controversy: Mercedes and Red Bull powertrains. Mercedes supplies engines to 4 teams heading into 2026, including their own works team, McLaren, Alpine, who are switching from Renault power, and Williams. Red Bull Powertrains, working alongside Ford, supplies Red Bull Racing and Racing Bulls. 6 out of 11 teams on the grid could potentially benefit from this alleged advantage, which means more than half the field sits on one side of this divide. The manufacturers who have formally requested FIA clarification occupy the other side. Ferrari supplies its own team plus Haas, a new entrant Cadillac. Audi enters as a full manufacturer for the first time with the renamed Sauber team. Honda now exclusively supplies Aston Martin after ending its partnership with Red Bull. The battle lines run straight through the middle of the paddock. What makes this situation even messier is how the regulations have evolved over recent months. Article C 5.4.3 of the Formula One technical regulations sits at the heart of this controversy, and it has been modified twice since October. The first change came in October of 2025, when the FIA added clarification that compression ratio measurement would be executed at ambient temperature, which codified what had already been standard practice. The second change landed just last week in December, and this one carried different weight. New wording appeared stating that the measurement process would be detailed by each power unit manufacturer according to FIA guidance document C042, with each manufacturer's procedure requiring approval by the FIA technical department and inclusion in their homologation dossier. Some Paddock insiders interpret this December amendment as an acknowledgement that the original regulations lacked sufficient specificity, while others view it as the FIA trying to get ahead of a controversy they saw coming. The governing body has issued an official statement addressing this situation, and their exact wording matters here. Their spokesperson said that the regulations clearly define the maximum compression ratio, and the method for measuring it is based on static conditions at ambient temperature. This procedure has remained unchanged despite the reduction in the permitted ratio for 2026. The statement went on to acknowledge that thermal expansion can influence dimensions at operating temperature, but the current rules do not require measurement under hot conditions. And here is the part that really stands out. The FIA added that the topic has been and is still being discussed within technical forums with the power unit manufacturers. The new limit naturally raises questions about interpretation and compliance, and the FIA said they continuously review such matters to ensure fairness and clarity. Adjustments to the regulations or to measurement procedures are possible in the future. Reading between those lines reveals the FIA's position. Thermal expansion exists as a real phenomenon. The current rules do not account for it. Technical discussions are happening behind closed doors, and no changes have been announced. Here's where things get really complicated. The 2026 power units have already reached advanced development stages. Homologation dossiers have been submitted, and designs are effectively locked in for the entire regulation cycle, running from 2026 through 2030. Sources describe the prospect of mandating hardware changes at this stage as a logistical nightmare, because you cannot redesign internal engine components overnight. These are incredibly complex pieces of machinery that have been years in development. This creates a genuine dilemma for everyone involved. If the FIA rules that this thermal expansion approach is illegal, teams that have designed their engines this way would need to make significant changes with almost no time remaining. Pre-season testing kicks off January the 26th in Barcelona. The season opens at the Australian Grand Prix on March 8th. But if the FIA declares everything legitimate, the other manufacturers face a potential disadvantage spanning the entire regulation cycle, which means 5 years of racing on what they perceive as an unfair playing field. Multiple reports indicate that Ferrari, Honda and Audi could file formal protests at Melbourne if the FIA fails to resolve this controversy before the season begins. The race specifically reported that if some teams remain unhappy about what others are doing, then the door is open for them to lodge a protest at the first race of the season in Australia. And motorsport.com described a potential protest as a real possibility. A new era way to start Formula One regulations would be exactly what this creates. Instead of focusing on the racing, the new cars, and the new competitive order, the paddock would find itself consumed by a technical and legal battle capable of reshaping the entire season. Speculation also surrounds how information about rival designs emerged in the first place. Motorsport.com noted that intelligence often surfaces when staff members change employers, potentially revealing details about a former team's activities. Whether that explains what happened here remains unverified, but it adds another layer to everything unfolding. A genuine grey area exists in the regulations. 2 major manufacturers face scrutiny, though nothing has been proven. 3 rivals demand clarity, and the FIA acknowledges the issue exists without committing to any changes. The 2026 Formula One season was supposed to represent a fresh start, with new power units featuring a 50-50 split between combustion and electrical power, the elimination of the MGUH, 100% sustainable fuels, and a complete reset of the competitive order. Instead, before a single qualifying lap has been completed, we already have the makings of a major loophole. The thermal expansion loophole highlights something we see time and time again in this sport. The regulations are only as clear as their enforcement, and clever engineers will always find the gaps. Whether this blows up at the Australian Grand Prix or gets quietly resolved behind closed doors, one thing remains certain. The 2026 season is already generating drama, and the racing hasn't even begun. This story continues developing quickly, so make sure you are subscribed if you want to stay updated on how it unfolds. Leave a comment and let me know whether you think Mercedes and Red Bull have crossed a line, or whether this is just smart engineering within the rules.